Jealous mom switched my wedding flowers to trigger my allergies. She then tried said king my fiancé while I was hospitalized. So I cut both of my parents off. So I, 23F, have been with my husband, 29M, for 3 years and we were supposed to get married a few days back. It didn't happen the way I wanted it to because my psycho mom pulled some really messed up crap which ended up sending me to the hospital with a crazy allergic reaction. She swapped out my floral arrangement of only orchids and peonies for a bunch of daisies, dahlias, and irises. I have a severe pollen allergy and also asthma, so it's really bad for me to be around pollen-heavy flowers, which all of the ones I mentioned above are. And the wedding venue was loaded with those flowers which drove me nuts and triggered an asthma attack so bad that I had to go to the ER, all thanks to my mom. For context, my mother, 44F, and I don't get along, as you all might have concluded by now. Growing up, my parents lived separately for a while and I got used to that. They had a lot of differences back then, so they separated when I was 7, but they ended up getting back together when I was 15 or so. Just so we're clear, my parents were never divorced and were still married on paper, but they lived separately and lived separate lives. I visited my mother every other weekend, but she'd never have time to spare for me and I'd end up spending most of my time by myself in my room at her place. So that was my relationship with my mom, and it was strained at best, but we were on okay terms. She did see other men when she was separated from my dad, but I don't know if those guys knew about her marriage beforehand and I never asked. As far as my dad is concerned, he never brought home any women, and even if he did see other women, I didn't get to know about it. They remained on good terms even while they were separated, since they'd parted mutually, and so co-parented me to the best of their abilities. Or, well, at least my dad tried to. My mother wasn't very keen on parenting me at all. I'm over it, though, and I didn't try to reconnect with her or fix my relationship with her after I left for college because I got too busy. College is also where I met my husband, and no, he wasn't a student there. I became friends with his sister during college, and 1 year, I had to stay back during Thanksgiving since I couldn't fly back home due to a blizzard. My friend lived nearby, so she decided to invite me to her house for Thanksgiving dinner, and that's where I met my husband for the first time. I was 19 at the time and he was 25, so I thought the age gap was a little weird, and I guess so did he, but neither of us did anything about it. But we did become friends and kept in touch. We'd speak to each other almost daily for a couple of months and even hung out a few times. After that, there was just no denying that we had a thing, but he was really shy and didn't ask me out, so I decided to ask him out instead, and it was really sweet. He ended up saying yes and we started dating. After I graduated, I moved in with him, and about 6 months later, we decided that it was time to tell our families about us. I already knew his family and they seemed to like me. I was hesitant to introduce him to mine, though. I was cool with my dad, but I didn't want to introduce him to my mom because I just had a gut feeling that something would go wrong if I did. I didn't even know it back then, but yeah, I was right. I did end up bringing him home to meet my parents during the holidays nevertheless, and back then, I believed that it had gone well. I didn't notice that my mother had been really quiet during the whole thing and had been actively avoiding looking at either of us. I was just glad she wasn't saying weird crap about me or making backhanded jokes about me like she usually does. He only met my family a couple of times after that, and I didn't notice anything off at the time, so I had no idea about what my mother was thinking then. 7 months ago, my husband proposed and I said yes. My parents flew down here to be able to attend the wedding 4 weeks ago as a surprise. I was happy about my dad being here, but not too thrilled that my mom was here too, because all she did was nitpick my choices and try to bring me down. I wanted to send her home without any reason, but I didn't, because then my dad would leave with her, and I didn't want that because then my wedding day would be really sad for me. My dad wasn't exactly aware of the Cold War between my mother and me, and I didn't want to tell him about it either because that would just lead to a load of unnecessary drama, because he'd want me to confront the issue and try to sort it out with her, which I just really didn't want to do. So I put up with her just for my dad's sake, and in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have. For my own and my dad's sake. I'd finalized my florist and floral arrangements and decorations for the wedding about 2 months ago, and incidentally, my mother found out from a list that I'd left on my desk that she happened to be friends with my florist. She'd been visiting my husband and me, which they'd been doing often ever since she and my dad came by, but I didn't think much of it. I just figured that they were visiting us almost every other day before the wedding because I'd been living away from home for a really long time, and I guess that my dad just wanted to see me more often, which is why they were visiting us so much before the wedding. I didn't find out that it was actually my mother's idea until yesterday, when I finally told my dad about my issues with my mother. Now, finally, it is the wedding day. 3 days ago, I was supposed to get married, but like I already said, I ended up in the hospital because my mother had swapped the hypoallergenic flowers I'd picked for my wedding for a bunch of pollen-heavy flowers. It triggered my asthma and I landed up in the hospital for the day, which obviously meant that I had to delay the wedding. It wasn't even just a couple of flowers, but the whole place was teeming with them, which is why it became incredibly difficult for me to even breathe there. My husband and I had visited the venue in the morning to check how the decorations were coming along, right before we went to our separate rooms in the hotel to get dressed, and they were still doing up the place, but they'd already made the floral arch and done the flowers, and I realized instantly that these were not the ones that I'd approved. As soon as I went inside, I started sneezing and coughing like crazy, and unfortunately, I'd forgotten my inhaler in the car, so it just got worse by the time my husband arrived with it, and I had to be driven to the ER because my lungs literally felt like they were closing in on themselves. I had only an hour to spare and the doctor said that I'd be fine, but I could not be back in the venue until it had been properly rid of all the flowers and traces of pollen, which would definitely take a while. We had no time to waste since we were already running pretty late, and I really didn't want to keep my guests waiting. So I sent my husband back to deal with that while I stayed in the hospital, waiting for my lungs to feel normal. I drove myself to the hotel so I could sit in my room with my bridesmaids and get my makeup done, at least because I was already running an hour late for the wedding. I'd realized on my drive that there had been no news from my husband after he'd left, so I tried to call him, but he didn't answer, and neither did any of my family. It was only while I was getting my makeup done that I received a call from my mother-in-law, telling me to come to her room immediately, saying that there was a family emergency that I needed to deal with urgently. So I rushed to her room and found my husband, my dad, my mother, and my mother-in-law sitting in the room. Everyone, with the exception of my mom, looked really disturbed, but she looked quite okay. There, I was told by my mother-in-law that while I was in the hospital, my mother had pulled my husband aside at the venue while they were all trying to speed up the process of clearing out and cleaning the place to get rid of the pollen and try to make a move on him. For a second, I couldn't even believe what my mother-in-law was telling me, and I looked at my husband for confirmation. When he nodded, I realized that this wasn't just some massive prank on me and they were all actually serious about this. My mother-in-law continued speaking and told me that she'd caught her in the act and had actually overheard my mother talking to my husband. It still makes my skin crawl to even think about that, and it's really difficult even typing it out for everyone to know, but I know I have to say it now. So my mother had told my husband that she'd always sensed the tension between them, and now that I was finally out of the picture, they could now get together for real instead of trying to push their feelings down. My husband tried to get away, obviously, but my mother insisted that she knew they had a thing and didn't want to waste the potential of what could have been. Luckily, my mother-in-law was there and she confronted my mother and even dragged her away from her son. That ended with a nasty argument between my mother and my mother-in-law at the venue. That had gone on for a while, which is why nobody had answered my calls. My husband finally had the sense to suggest that everyone be brought to the hotel instead of creating a scene in public in front of all the staff at the venue, which is what they did. And now, they were here to ask me what I wanted to do about this situation since it was our wedding. I didn't even think twice before telling my mother to get up, pack her bags, and leave right then. My mother didn't argue either, and neither did she look back at my dad to ask him to come along, which was surprising because she literally just tried to cheat on him with her daughter's fiancé on her wedding day. I also realized that she must have spoken to my florist and changed the order for my wedding, and the florist must have done it because they were friends. When I spoke to the vendor, she told me that she'd received a call from me a couple of weeks back with a request to change the order and a proper discussion about what I wanted, which is why she'd done so. I'm guessing my mother must have gotten a hold of my phone and made the call while I wasn't in the room, because I do have a tendency to forget things.